Okay, so I am cutting binding strips for my Ninja Star sampler quilt. You can see I've already got some of them done. For these, I'm going to be using diagonal seams, and how I would cut these for the diagonal seams is actually a little bit different than how I would cut this if I was going to use flat seams. So let me show you what I mean. So I've got my fabric pressed, and I've actually got this pressed to where there's a hard crease at the bottom. So I have it folded over, selvage to selvage, and there's a hard crease at the bottom. And you can see on these binding strips that I've already cut that I did not remove the selvages, and you don't have to remove the selvages if you're going to use diagonal seams. And I mean, you can if you want to, but you don't have to remove the selvages, and that's just because when you make that diagonal seam, there's going to be a little bit of waste that gets cut off anyway, and this selvage will be part of that waste that gets cut off anyway. So when I'm cutting binding for diagonal seams, I actually don't bother to cut off those selvages. So you can see right here, Ninja Star quilt was quilted, ready to bind. This is the binding I'm going to use. I'm so excited. That's going to look so pretty together. But back at it, let's look at this and how I've got this lined up. So I've got this lined up so that this hard crease that I pressed here is lined up with one of these lines, and with one of these lines on my cutting mat. And for this, I'm actually going to use the lines on my cutting mat more so than just the lines on my ruler. So I've got a 6x24 ruler, rotary cutter, and fabric is on the mat. So I've got that bottom line lined up, and we're going to be cutting 2.5 inch binding strips. So I'm going to find my 2.5 inch increments. So we're going to use 15 and 12.5 line for these. I'm just going to cut a couple strips, but what we'll do is we will use our ruler, and we're going to line the edge of that ruler up with one of these 2.5 inch increments. So the edge will be lined up with 15. And this is actually a straight edge here because I've already been cutting some of the binding, but I'm going to kind of give myself a little bit of leeway just in case moving that around got that to where it wasn't folded perfectly anymore. So what you're going to do, have the edge lined up with 15 here, and the edge lined up with 15 here. Now, something you can also check to make sure you have it lined up well is we've got that edge lined up with 15. You're going to have these lines that are on your ruler lining up nicely with the lines on your mat. So you can see I've got this vertical line lined up pretty well. But another test I can do, I can also line up that horizontal line and have it lined up pretty well. So you can see how well those lines kind of match up with each other, and you'll just go up to the top and make sure that you have those matched up well too. And then you're just going to get your rotary cutter. You'll hold firm pressure with your hand, and you'll get your rotary cutter and trim off that extra. So you'll just right to the side, hold it down really good. Sometimes I get like a can of tomato sauce, or it's just a heavy can to put at the top here to help me hold this ruler still so that it doesn't act uncooperative and mess me up. And then we'll just do that same thing going down in increments of 2.5 until we get all our strips cut. So the next place we'll cut will be at the 12.5 inch line, and line that up just the same as you did the 15 inch line. And then after that, it'll be the 10 inch line. So once you cut that, this you will have this hard crease here, but I mean, once you bind your quilt and wash it, you're not going to see that anymore anyway. And I said this is a little different than how I would do this if I were making flat seams or straight seams in my binding. And let me just kind of show you how I would do that. So with that, I would actually fold this over, double it up. And it does not have to be perfect because I'm going to whack both of those ends off anyway. So right here at the bottom, it does not have to be perfectly meeting up there. You just want your fabric smoothed out, nice and flat. And we're going to do the same thing as far as using our ruler to line up with the 2.5 inch increments on our cutting mat, but we are not going to necessarily worry about that these are matched up perfect or that they are lined up with one of those lines. So we'll just make those cuts, and then when we're done, we will come over to the other side of our mat like I'm doing here, and then we would just line up with the lines going in the opposite direction, grab our rotary cutter and cut along the side of that. And then we would do the same thing up here to make sure we remove the selvages. Just line up your ruler with the lines on the other side, making sure you're removing the selvages, and then cut there. And what that'll do is that'll make those strips nice and squared for you, and they will be a little bit shorter, but it does save you a lot of time in the cutting process, that you don't have to, that you can cut 2 of them at a time, actually 4 since we're cutting those strips in half, but you can cut more length of your binding at a time that way. And then you're not having to worry so much about it lining up. Now, if you have directional prints, then yeah, you would need to worry about it, but this isn't directional, so don't really care. And still have nice and square strips. So, but that only works if you are using straight seams for your binding, and if you are using prints that you don't necessarily care about the direction. So here's one of those strips that I cut using the method I would use for diagonal seams, and let's just open that up and see how it looks. So if I didn't make that crease and didn't line it up at the bottom, or if I did it wrong, there's going to be like a weird wavy part when I open this up, instead of just a crease, sort of like the, kind of like the middle of the Jelly Roll effect. So let's see. So you see that crease? Looks pretty. Let's lay this out straight. But that looks pretty nice and smooth to me.